Angelos, that you guys can hear me and see me? Yep. All right. So, welcome to the workshop, the seminar on adjudication. In this workshop, I'm going to try and bring forward to you kind of my philosophy on judging and how to practically do it, because oftentimes we hear a lot of words that are used that cool. We the Facebook messages I'm going to be getting in between, by the way, are from Mila and Angela. So that's not me being rude-ish. So basically, we use a lot of words to describe what adjudication should be, but at no point do we explain what those actually mean. So when I was a kid, people would always tell me that I need to sing on key. And for a long time, I just thought on key was code word for well, until my father explained to me that you could sing something starting at a certain note and sing it starting from a different note, and those are two different keys. And only once I understood the terms being used could I use that. Could I implement what people are telling me. So that's kind of what we're going to try and do, is clear up the terms that we talk about when we discuss adjudication and go through how we practically do this. Depending on timing and how you guys feel, we're going to split the time at the end between questions and answers. And if you guys would like, we could do a worked example, though the technical part of that might be questionable, but we'll see what we can do about it. So I'm gonna screen share the PowerPoint, and you should be able to see it now. Basically, what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about starting with what adjudication actually is, right? So in the most basic sense, adjudication is like analyzing the arguments that you hear throughout the debate and figuring out who ranks above whom and in what order that happens, right? So if you try and think about it, we all know what debating looks like, right? So try and think about it as a whip speech, right? What a whip speech does is it kind of tries to break down what we do, what happened in the debate, and figure out, given what happened, how teams rank comparatively, right? So that's what we're trying to do, except in an unbiased sense, right? A whip speech is always trying to show that one specific team is winning, whereas we're trying to show that any one of the teams can win. We're trying to figure out what actually happened. Now, it's important to note here, if you're not good at whip speaking, this doesn't necessarily translate into not being good at judging. Same thing is in the inverse, right? People can be amazing judges, but not good whip speakers, right? By the way, sometimes one leads to the other. I used to be an extension speaker until I started judging, and then I realized that, I should probably do whip speeches since they're basically the same thing for me, okay? The second thing adjudication is it's a tool to make debate better in a couple of senses, right? For the people receiving the debate, it gives them feedback, meaning understanding how well they did in this particular round, a feedback loop of saying what I did now was actually a good thing, whereas what I'm going to do next time, I can figure out if it should be like the time before or not. And also, it's somewhat more fun making it more competitive, right? And thirdly, I think adjudication is fun in and of itself, right? It's kind of like a logic puzzle that we have to solve. We see a bunch of statements that are being made and kind of piece them together and put them together and figure out where teams are arguing and what they actually mean by this, and figure out, given that, who's winning in that argument, right? So in the same sense that you have to come and try and think of novel ideas and ways to actually put analysis forward when you're debating, when you're judging, you have to make that same logical puzzle just when you're given the arguments and try and rank them and figure out who's above who, right? So now let's start off by understanding who we are, right? Because we are a very large spread of different sorts of people, and we all have different ideas. We all have different beliefs. We all have different value systems, and there's something to be said to try and make adjudication more objective. Meaning, when I go into a room, I know what's going to be the call. Like when I see a debate, I know what's going to be the call over a large spread of people. So what we try and do is try and tell you what you can bring forward into a debate. What about what you're saying? What about what you actually believe in who you are gets put forward into the debate, right? So that's where we came up with ordinary intelligent voters. Ordinary intelligent voters is what you're supposed to be. A couple of guidelines as to what this means. This means that you are people who understand and know what's happening in the world to a basic extent. Meaning, you know what's in the headlines, you don't know technical data. So if you're a philosophy student, saying the word Kant and not explaining what exactly his philosophy is not enough. If you're an economist, talking about the different nuances of economics. By the way, this is where it's clear that I have no idea what I'm talking about when I speak about economics, since I have zero examples that I can throw out here as to what is technical data that economists might be privy to. But what you're trying to do is figure out what the ordinary person would know. So what does this person know? This person knows headlines, right? Now it's important to note over here, headlines doesn't mean what's happening in British news. Headlines means something that someone out of your country, out of a certain country, would know. So if I'm talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, probably something most people would know about. I don't speak about specific headlines happening in Israel, since other people aren't likely to know. Same thing with British politics. I could probably know things like Brexit happening. I don't know necessarily the exact struggle inside the Labour leadership, right? And, examples need to be to a wide audience, and someone who is international as opposed to someone who is a specific nationality. The other thing you are logical people, meaning if the speakers are trying to trick you with logical fallacies, this is something you would notice. If someone jumps a logical step, this is something that you, as an ordinary intelligent voter, would notice, right? So that's where you don't step into the debate. You're not rebutting arguments, but you're seeing how well analyzed they actually are. You're seeing how strong the logic that's being used is, right? So that's what you know. You know the logic. You know to follow logical steps and see if they add up one to each other, right? And you obviously know the rules of British parliamentary debating. So you can't someone jumping in and screaming out in the middle of someone else's speech, while an actual ordinary intelligent voter might not realize that this is something not allowed in debating, you as the judge do, right? So this is basically the guidelines of what we are when we go into the debate. We don't have certain preconceived notions about whether practical is more important than principled arguments. We don't have any preconceptions about what type of philosophy and moral structure is the correct one. We aren't necessarily utilitarian. We aren't necessarily deontological. But what we do have is a specific common sense that tells us where burdens lie, right? So if someone's trying to prove that murdering people is like legit, then that probably takes more proof to compel an ordinary intelligent voter than someone trying to prove that stealing food in order to save yourself is something that's legitimate, right? Which type of philosophy they use is not something you're decided about, okay? It's weird that I can't ask if there are any questions, but we're going to move on to the next part. And are there any questions on the Facebook or YouTube page so far? Mila? No, doesn't seem so. Okay. So, now, once we understand who we are, we need to see and understand what convinces us. Okay? What do we mean when we say that something is persuasive? How do we decide if we, quote unquote, buy an argument, right? So there are two things that go into this. One, the rules of BP decide what convinces us to a certain extent, right? So whereas it might be in a vacuum, right, persuasive for opposition whip to give a whole bunch of arguments that no one had the chance to deal with, the rules of BP are structured for both logic, right, trying to find who was logically the strongest team, and for fairness, understanding that that structure that we have causes certain unfairness, right? Opening proposition doesn't have a real way to answer closing opposition, right? So we have to try and balance between these two things, picking the really most convincing team and being the most fair, right? So what does that mean? That means with regards to what convinces us, if someone gets up and starts drawing a graph and using like a video to get us to feel bad for something or to understand a certain concept, then that's illegitimate, even though it might be persuasive. So that's the first thing we have to take into account when we decide what convinces us. The second thing is the actual idea of persuasiveness. And now we're going to try and understand what that means, right? So first of all, realize that persuasiveness means persuading us to their side of their debate, right? You could be extremely persuasive about something that is irrelevant to the debate. So if we're debating legalizing prostitution, and I am extremely persuasive in telling you that lowering taxes will bring about economic growth, that might be very persuasive. But in the context of the debate, that doesn't help us, right? So now we have to realize that it then splits up into two. One, persuading us of the importance of an idea. Two, persuading us that this idea is actually true, that it's well substantiated, right? So, sorry. I like to look at it as a graph, okay? Basically, every argument that happens needs to be put on this graph, which decides how impactful it is, meaning how important it is. And this is important both in the context of the debate, right? Meaning, is this something that if I can prove that opposition teams, everything they're trying to reach is not going to happen, for the context of the debate, meaning how easy it is for the judge to make their decision, that is a very important argument. There's also real world importance that can be persuasive in impact, right? This is going to cause the death of a lot of people, right? So all of these get measured in as to how impactful an argument is, how important it is in the context of the debate. The second thing we need to take into account is the likelihood that it will actually come about. So if someone is to make the argument that lowering taxes will bring about economic growth, the first thing I have to understand is how impactful that is. How important is economic growth? What does that even mean? Is this something that is going to save people's lives? Is this something that's just going to make certain rich people much richer, but the rest of but basically everyone poorer? But you know, if you look at economic growth as a whole, it's made things better, right? I need to understand how important it is to make this decision, right? On the other, in that same vein, if the entire thing that the other side is trying to bring, like prop in this example, is economic growth, then this is an impactful argument insofar as both teams agree on the importance of this, right? The second thing that we need to take into account, right? That's the y-axis. The second thing we need to take into account is the likelihood, right? How likely is it that it's actually going to bring about economic growth? That lowering taxes is going to bring about economic growth, right? This is where the logic and the analysis comes in, analyzing the steps that are taken, like the way that this would come about, analyzing it in a bunch of different manners might make something more likely. They've convinced me that it's more likely, right? This this needs to do both. This needs to both. Sorry, this is taken into account with respect to the burdens that the argument takes upon itself. What do I mean by that? So I gave earlier, and I use we because I am used to speaking in a debate, and so I always just assume I have a partner. I gave the example earlier of taking upon yourself the burden of proving that killing people is perfectly fine, right? For enjoyment. This takes upon itself a very strong and high burden. So the ability to reach a high likelihood is harder. It's harder to reach that high likelihood. On the other hand, proving to you something simple, that, you know, cutting off water supplies will make people thirsty, is much easier. It's more easy to take to prove that and make that seem very likely. The second thing is, that's the burdens with regards to how high of a burden of proof is needed. The second thing is that arguments take upon themselves burdens in order to reach the conclusion. So if I were to set out to prove to you on this house believes that targeted military strikes are immoral, and I were to say this is breaking international law, I have added a burden on myself to prove that breaking international law means that something is immoral, right? Because what I'm trying to prove is that because breaking international law, because targeted military strikes are breaking international law, that causes it to be immoral, because that's the motion, that's the side I'm defending in this house, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that likelihood, if I don't meet all of the burdens that my argument sets out for me, is going to be much lower. Okay? So now if I'm going to look at the graph that I have, right, with this being importance and this being likelihood, just to try and give you a couple of examples to understand what I mean. A complete throwaway comment that says everyone's going to die would probably be very high on the impact, but have a low likelihood. So it would be a very thin strip, right? On the other hand, if I were to prove to you that because of a certain motion, everyone will have $1 less, right? My likelihood would maybe go up because for example, if the motion is taking away $1 from everyone, but the impact is very low. I don't understand why that's a very bad thing, right? However, Now we get to arguments that are slightly, more that are slightly more hard to compare. So I could have an argument that's pretty impactful, but isn't proven all the way through, and I can have an argument that's proven really well, but is slightly less impactful. And here comes the job where we try and compare things. Ultimately, what we're looking for, and I'm going to use quotes here, is the bigger box, right? We're trying to sum up the impact and the likelihood of an argument to try and figure out if this is something that is lesser, or if this is something that is convincing and persuasive. That's how we get to figuring out how persuasive an argument is. It's basically kind of drawing this graph and figuring out what that means, how impactful the argument is made, and how likely they've managed to do it. That's what we mean when we say something is persuasive. Okay? The second thing is robustness. An argument is stronger when it is robust. What do I mean by robust? That's not loading. Basically, robustness says that an argument is stronger when it's harder to knock down, right? That's another way of looking at likelihood or how well substantiated something is to try and figure out how hard would it be to take down this argument, to show that this argument is wrong. So that's another way of figuring out if an argument is likely. Okay? So that's how we figure out what convinces us. Now we need to choose between two teams, right? Because both teams have managed to make arguments impactful and persuasive to a certain extent. Now, before we get into that, when we compare teams, it's important to understand that it's true that an argument that's not rebutted to an extent stands in debate. However, looking at the graph and understanding what we were talking about just now, arguments that aren't well substantiated or aren't very impactful aren't true to an 100% extent. What do I mean by that? If I were to say this is going to cause everyone to die, then the likelihood I have given it stays. Sorry, I'm a bit sick. The likelihood I've given it stays. So the complete assertion that everyone would die because of a certain motion is a very low likelihood. Unrebutted, that low likelihood stands. There is a 1 in a million chance that everyone will die because of what I just said, right? In the adjudicator's head. It's not true, however, that if someone were to say everyone's going to die because of this and no one rebutted it, that's true, meaning that everyone will literally die because of it. On the other hand, it's important to note that there isn't a certain bar that one has to meet for an argument to stand. Meaning, an argument that isn't made well isn't completely knocked down because it wasn't proven to a sufficient extent. What it does, what happens to that argument is that it's just not likely to be very impactful in the comparison between two teams because the argument wasn't very likely to happen, because it wasn't the likelihood of it, right? If we were to look back at that graph, the likelihood of it is low. So that ties into the idea of holistic judging. Holistic judging means taking everything into account. There isn't a sort of idea of one strike you're out. You made one, there is one sort of argument that wins, and that is the only thing that decided the debate. That argument that you may have found as a judge very important needs to be compared to the other arguments, needs to be put on balance with everything else that put in the debate. The second thing about holistic judging is that there are no negative points. If I made an argument that wasn't good, meaning that wasn't good in convincing you to do something, then the only thing that happened is that I wasted my time. I'm not less convincing because of this argument as a team. Meaning, unless a team has made a point that actively hurts their case, right? That actively proves the opposite of what they're trying to show, this doesn't count against them. We can't compare two teams and say it's really tight between them, but opposition made a stupid point, so we'll give the win to proposition. That doesn't matter. Okay? 3, everything that is said counts. Meaning the fact that something was labeled in rebuttal doesn't mean it doesn't count for the comparison between two teams. The POIs that are given are part of our decision making, right? All of the points that we make are something that we need that are made are something that need to be weighed against each other. Okay, we can't just disregard certain things that happen in debate. All right. Now there are two things that we need to compare, right? If we look back at the graph that we showed, right? What we're trying to do basically is figure out who has the bigger box, right? Who is on balance more impactful and more impactful and likely in their arguments, meaning who is more persuasive, okay? One of the things that helps us decide in that case is rebuttal, okay? Now, rebuttal is something that a lot of things are labeled as that aren't actually rebuttal, and a lot of things that aren't labeled as rebuttal are actually rebuttal, right? So there are two distinct versions of rebuttal that we need to take into account. One is competing analysis, right? So I said that legalizing prostitution will cause women to be viewed in an objectified way, and the other team says that legalizing prostitution, it's not that it's going to cause them to be objectified, it's going to cause them to be empowered. Now, this isn't a rebuttal so much in the sense that these are two competing ideas that need to be weighed against each other, right? Both things can be true. It can cause objectification, and it can also cause empowerment, right? And so whoever is more compelling in that regard is the person who is going to win that, we'll call it clash, right? The mini clash, okay? In the same sense, right? If I were to say that doing like forcing voting forcing people to vote will cause more people to be involved in democracy because they'll have to go vote and then they're going to look into who the people are. And the other team says, no, rebuttal. That's not what's going to happen. People are going to be dismayed with democracy because they're going to feel that this is forced upon them and they're not going to care who they vote for, right? And so they'll give it a lower value in their head since they didn't think about it and make a reasoned decision, right? These two things can affect different types of people, and so these are two competing analyses on the question of whether or not this is going to cause people to be more in favor or less in favor of democracy, or more involved or less involved in democracy after the motion. This is different than negative analysis, meaning explaining why the analysis someone gives is wrong, right? So if I were to make the argument that, I'm going to if I were to make the argument that people will go vote and see that voting is important because they've done it, then analyzing and saying, no, you made a logical leap. You said that just because someone does something, they then decide that this is important, right? But people do mundane things that they dislike all the time in life, right? People wash their car and they think that that's a really annoying thing that they don't want to do, right? people walk outside in the cold and they're not happy about that. So just because someone does something doesn't mean that they therefore think it's important. This isn't a competing analysis. This is an explanation of why the logic used in the argument before you was wrong. Why is this important? Okay? This distinction is important in order to understand how we compare two teams, right? Because rebuttal is useful insofar as it manages to make the analysis of the other side weaker in the comparison to you. So if we look at the graph, right? If I were to, if this, right, the now bolded argument was my democracy point beforehand, after the rebuttal, in comparison to me, the impact hasn't changed, right? Because I didn't argue the impact, but the likelihood has gone down, right? Because I explained that the logic used was bad, right? So now my argument, which I made in orange, right, this bigger box, is actually bigger than the red box. This is in thanks to the rebuttal, the negative analysis I gave, right? On the other hand, with competing analysis, I just have two new boxes that I have to compare. I'm going to try and stop using the boxes analogy now, since some of you may have lost me at this point with that analogy. So I'll try and explain it using persuasiveness, right? An argument that you're being compared to is less persuasive if you've given negative analysis to it. If you've given competing analysis in your rebuttal, then the argument is just as persuasive, and you need to be more persuasive with regards to this specific question. That's the two different types of rebuttal and what they mean in the extent of comparing between two teams. Okay? The second thing is, logic is necessary to the same extent. We need to be as critical when listening to rebuttal as we are with listening to other things. With listening to, we'll call it positive analysis. We need to notice if there are logical leaps in the rebuttal. We need to notice if people are straw manning or not fully answering the logic behind a point. These are things we need to take into account when we're looking at rebuttal. One of the things that helps us compare teams are clashes. Clashes are saying you both have proven lots of arguments. You've been very persuasive on certain ideas. You've made up lots of pretty boxes, right? Now we need to stack them up against each other in those clashes, right? In those specific questions that the weighing of these two arguments or these 5 arguments will determine the answer to a question. So if we go back to the prostitution debate example, the question being asked over there, right? The example of objectification versus empowerment is how will this affect women, right? To a very like banal clash name, right? If we were to look at the example of voting, this is the clash would be, how does it affect people's view on democracy? These are lots of arguments that put together cause you to be able to answer that question. And there we need to judge on those questions who is more persuasive. Okay? So that's how clashes help us. They help organize it into having to compare only 1 or 2 questions as opposed to having to compare things in a vacuum. It's important to note when we're talking about adjudication, the comparison between 2 clashes should come first and foremost by active comparison, meaning teams explaining why a certain clash is more important than the other. If that doesn't happen, the second way that we can hope to compare is by how impactful each the teams have made those clashes. How much stress did they put on them? How well did they manage to convince you that this is really important? Okay, so that's the way we compare clashes, hopefully. In the last extent, if there's nothing else to do, people have been like equally persuasive about the impact of clashes. They didn't do anything outright. Then you have to rely on what you think is probably more important. But this is only as a last resort. And probably you'll want to try and see who managed to win more in one of the clashes and make your decision based on that. We want to take our own ideas of what's more important as a very final last case scenario, and only in the most extreme cases. Okay. Finally, when comparing between two teams, all of the comparisons need to be comparative. Okay, that sounds silly to say, but saying a certain team made a bad point or didn't manage to convince you a lot is not a useful statement in adjudication. The useful statement is managed to convince me less. It's always a question of persuading, of comparison between any two teams. Now, so all of the things that you're going through in your head, all of your thinking when you're judging the adjudication you do, always needs to be in comparison with what we got from the other teams. Now, at this point, I'm going to finish up the section on how we choose between two teams by making the following note clear. This is true about every two teams in the debate, meaning this is something we should do in every comparison. First opposition to first proposition, first opposition to second proposition, first opposition to second opposition, and so on, right? We need to compare all pairs of teams and figure out between them who manages to win. Okay? So, next section. Sorry. Now we're going to talk about some difficult cases that exist in debate. Okay? So, the first one is a hung case scenario. A hung case scenario is a scenario in which a case comes after someone has the ability to respond to it. Okay? So a couple of examples where this might happen. The classic example is on the diagonal, right? So the case that second opposition brings forward, first proposition doesn't have a chance to directly engage other than POIs, right? The less known scenario, or the less talked about scenario, is deputy leader of opposition, right? So the second speaker in first opposition has a case that first proposition can never respond to, right? So this needs to be taken into account. Why? Because remember we said that there are two things that go into what we're looking at in debate. We're looking at logical persuasiveness, and we're looking at fairness. So even if we're looking at logical persuasiveness, it's like the fact that one team said that first opposition had a case and first proposition didn't have a chance to answer makes it less persuasive insofar as something wasn't really attacked. It didn't have the chance to get attacked by this team, and so we don't know if it's as strong as we may think it is or as weak as we think it is, right? Because the other team didn't have a chance to respond to this, okay? So how do we decide between these? How do we decide in cases of a hung case, okay? So there are three criteria that go into this decision. One is how expected a certain argument is, right? So this is something that comes with time as we judge. But for example, if the motion is this House would abolish taxes, opposition should expect an argument about legitimacy of taxation, or opposition should expect an argument about like free market something or other that says that this is going to make everyone better off, right? Even in a case in which opposition didn't have the chance to engage, so first proposition didn't bring up these ideas at all, and only second proposition bring up these ideas, first opposition doesn't have a chance to engage. But this is something they should have known. Now, again, this doesn't go and completely erase the edge that second proposition has, right? If only because first opposition didn't have a chance to engage with the nuances, with the exact analysis given by second proposition. What this means is that it just lowers and makes easier the comparison. It makes the comparison easier. We would have to be, and now we go into the second cumulative criteria, right? All of these things work together to decide whether or not a hung case would beat the other team. So the second question is, how much of a chance to engage was given? So if second proposition would have gone up to a POI in first opposition and said, we're going to talk about the free market and how this makes everyone better off, first opposition has had a better chance to engage, right? These are not, by the way, it's important to note, these are not binary criteria, right? These are scales, right? They're a spectrum. And within those spectrum, we have to place things, right? We have to place hung cases. The third thing that we need to take into account is how robust an argument is, right? The final thing we need to do is kind of compare how much more persuasive a certain argument is than the other argument, right? So even if no chance to engage was given, and even if there was no way that they could possibly think that this was the case that the other team is going to bring up, right? If the new case, the hung case, is much better, is analyzed to a much larger extent, is more impactful, or some combination thereof, right? That is enough to give over the win to the other to give a win to the hung case team. If so, and at this point it kind of seems fuzzy, right? Like, what is expected enough? What is enough chance to engage? What is more robust enough? And that's where we kind of have to, figure out how well we see this as a reason to give a team above another team, right? There isn't a number I can give you to tell you it needs to be expected 3, or a combination of these 3 criteria should add up to 10, right? But it needs to these are things we need to take into account when making that decision. Okay? This comes from practice. This comes from judging with good adjudicators. This comes from thinking about just as when we make moral decisions, we think back on them and try and figure out and work it out with ourselves. Was this the right decision to make? This is a kind of control feedback loop where we have to constantly question ourselves, and after debates where we make calls like this, say, was it really robust enough to make that difference? And over time, we kind of get to an equilibrium. And the interesting thing is, if you look at judges across the world, this equilibrium tends to be pretty similar. So I do tend to say that this is something that comes with time when you're adjudicating, and that this isn't something that you can teach so much as something that you understand with yourself, right? Finally, the last difficult case that I'm going to talk about, and if there are other difficult cases, obviously feel free to add them as questions, right? And we'll discuss them in the Q&A. Is extensions, right? In two senses. One, there are two ways in which we need to look at extensions. What do I mean by extensions? Second proposition give an extension above first proposition. It's difficult to know who was better, right? So two rules of thumb to look into this. One, it's important to notice that there is a burden of back half teams to explain why their extension was important, or more specifically, more important than opening half, right? Now, again, like every burden that exists in debate, this isn't a binary burden that you either meet or don't meet, and it isn't something that gives you an automatic anything. Meaning, even if you don't meet this burden, even if you don't specifically say outright, this is why it's more important than the other clash, than what first half gave you. It depends on the specific debate, right? It depends how strong the argument is. Is it something that needs to be explained, or is it that obvious that they're more important? Obviously, an extension that doesn't do this, that doesn't do the weighing, is less persuasive on the comparison with top half, right? Because they didn't give me outright reasons. Sometimes those reasons, by the way, are hidden within the argument. Sometimes they're not explicitly said, but we can understand them based on the impact given to certain cases, to back half cases, right? So second half has a burden of weighing their extension, but that burden isn't something that they necessarily have to do in every case, just something that will help them, and in tight cases may say, listen, I'm not 100% sure what's more important. I really don't know. However, because back half doesn't explain why they're more important, they have more of a burden to show that, and therefore they're less persuasive than top half. They fall under top half, okay? So that's the first thing that we need to understand when comparing an extension to opening half. The second thing we need to understand is that only the addition that the second team gives is what we compare on their side. So if they said lots of things that are very true, but first half said them, this is specifically when we're comparing a back half team to, for example, second proposition to an opening opposition, right? We only compare the addition, the delta, if you have it, if you will, the delta of what they've given us to opening opposition. Meaning, if opening opposition proved to us that more people are going to be hurt because of no seatbelt laws, right? And closing proposition, repeat word for word what opening proposition say, and about why it's not legitimate to have seatbelt laws, but then add also having seatbelt laws causes people to, for example, put their seatbelt on during driving, which may cause extra accidents. Also, it's uncomfortable when you're driving and you have less mobility, and that also causes accidents. The comparison between first opposition and second proposition would be, where are more people going to die? Because legitimacy is completely first proposition, and now we have to compare the first opposition case of people aren't wearing seatbelts and therefore they'll die in car crashes to the second opposition new case of people are going to die because they were busy putting on their seatbelt, or because they were putting on their, or because they were uncomfortable, or not having enough they don't have enough movement available to them when they have their seatbelt, right? And that's the comparison that needs to be made, okay? So only the addition the second team has added is what we take into account, all right? Now, now we're going to look at a couple of more technical issues, right? This is where we go down into what we actually should be doing when we're judging and how that works, okay? So, we'll start with judges' discussion, okay? Meaning what we do after the debate has finished, and we now need to talk about it with the chair, or if we're the chair, what we did, right? So, the first thing you start off with is they're going to give you a few minutes to think about your call. This is where you go over your notes, and hopefully within your notes, and we'll discuss note-taking very soon, within your notes you'll have bolded items or underlined things or a summary of cases that came afterwards. And you'll quickly go over those concepts and figure out, remind yourself what happened in this debate. The second thing you want to do is during the debate, you've been thinking, right? And at this point, there are specific questions you should have for yourself, right? Does opening government say anything about a certain clash, right? Is closing opposition really answering opening government in that case? Let's double check and see what the actual analysis given by opening proposition is, right? All of these things are what you do in the 2 minutes. You give yourself time to quickly go over the main ideas of what happened in the debate, and more importantly, to answer the questions you need to have for yourself. Okay? Then you're going to want to give a call, okay? This call doesn't need to be a full call, right? You don't necessarily need to know exactly who was first, second, third, and fourth. At this point, what you want to do is give the closest thing you can to a call. So what that means is, for example, just giving, I know that first opposition is last, and that's all I know, is enough at this point. Why do we want to be able to at least give this amount of information? Because using this information, or the basic idea of what people have going through their head of the judges, and this is true for you guys as well when you're chairing, this is information that you use in order to build the conversation that's going to happen, build the judges' discussion. You need to know what things need to be cleared up, right? And which comparisons are very important to make because people strongly disagree about them, or, and this is just as important, which comparisons can be made fairly quickly because everyone seems to agree about them, right? So it's important to give as much information at this part as possible, but only with regards to first, second, third, or fourth. I think their first, their fourth, and I'm not sure between second and third. I think their first, their third, and their first and their third, but I don't know what to do with the other two teams. Or just say, I don't know what to do with closing proposition, but here's how I see the other three teams in comparison with each other. Okay? Then, the other thing to notice when we're having the conversation is to be as specific as possible. Don't say, they made a good point. Be clear as to which point you think they made, which point you're talking about, right? Because most teams make more than just 1 point. So they had a very good point, their third point about seatbelt laws or whatever, whichever example we're using at this point. And you want to be comparative in this, right? So you want to say, not only was this point good, it was explained well because of I especially like the analysis given here. It was better than opening opposition because they managed to paint me more realistic picture of the world, because they managed to break it down into exactly the steps that are going to happen like on the ground. They managed to ground it in reality with more examples. These are ways in which we can compare, right? Or they were more impactful. They showed me why this was more important, right? And finally, obviously, this needs to be done holistically. So not just that one point was better. I think in a certain clash, this is what wins that clash, and the clash that we're talking about is more important than the other things said because of X, Y, and Z, right? So we need to take everything into account when we're making our call. Finally, the chair, whether that be you guys or whether you guys are wings, is the person who leads the discussion, decides where the discussion is going. So that means that if the chair says, or if you guys as chair say, I would like you to compare first proposition with first opposition, that's the comparison you should be talking about. Later on, if it's important for you to make to have a certain discussion, make that clear. I really think we should discuss second opposition in comparison with first. But this is a decision by the chair. Why? Because usually, and especially in tournaments, you don't have that much time. You have 15 minutes, and at a certain point, we need to decide this is the decision maker, and we're going to run this through them, right? So this is where I'm telling where I'm explaining why it's important to have this why it's important to have this the discussion formatted as it is. Okay. Now I'm just going to take a second. We've finished the section on judges discussion. There seems to be a question on Facebook. I'm just going to read it out. Okay. Anton asks, would you consider quotations of research that, for example, prove that reducing mobility with seatbelts causes more accidents convincing? So, Anton, that's a good question. This is where we go back into the idea of the ordinary informed, the average informed citizen, right? That person is unlikely to know this research. So at this point, what's the argument that's being made? The argument's being made is it reduces research mobility because someone else said it reduces research mobility. Now, we discussed that we are logical people. Since I don't necessarily have a reason to believe this specific research, both because I don't know how scientifically strong it was done. Did they have a control group, or all the different things that goes into making a research a good research, right? I don't know how many test subjects were in that. I don't know if it was peer reviewed, right? I, by the way, don't actually know if this is a real research that happened, right? So all of these things make it not very convincing to me. If, on the other hand, what they were to do is to say, here is the research made, right? There is a research that was done in this field. Here's why they found that using seatbelts reduces mobility. Because having the ability to lean forward quickly in order to hold onto the steering wheel strong is something that is very important. That's a natural reflex people have. Or because people feel uncomfortable with the seatbelt, they often put it under their armpit, and then they don't have a strong ability to move their usually their, at least not in England, their right hand down sharply, right? These are arguments and reasons that this research might give, right? So that's, I think, how I would go about understanding, weighing and deciding the persuasiveness of someone quoting research. So in short, telling me that someone else did this isn't as convincing, and isn't very convincing, since I don't know anything about what went into this research or if it even happened. I don't find it very persuasive. Okay. Cool. So let's move on to the next section, which is giving feedback. Okay, this is important. This is where we as judges explain what went on in the adjudication. So usually I think it's best to format feedback as follows. You give the call, right? So first over second, over third, over fourth. And then you give the rationale. Why is first place above second place? Why is second place above third place? All the comparisons you need to do. Over here, you want to be as specific as possible. You want to give not just they analyzed better, but where they analyzed better, why the analysis was better, just like we talked about in the judges discussion, right? And finally, there's individual feedback. At least that's how we do it in Israel. I understand that this is not the same in every country, but this is just how I go about giving feedback after a round. And obviously, it depends on how much time you have in this specific tournament. So you want to be as specific as possible, both in the rationale and in the feedback. In order to give feedback that's as good as possible, it's best to make notes throughout the discussion, right? Throughout the debate. When they're speaking, you want to say they're not comparing enough actively, right? And you write that down in a little red pen or whatever it is, and that way you already have the ideas that you want to bring forward to the debaters when you're giving them feedback. Finally, the third thing is that you should try noticing trends, and that's especially true with people you judge often. Okay, so if you're judging in your club or whatever it is, you see the same debaters over and over again. That means you can notice if they consistently don't answer the strongest case that the other side gives. Sorry, 1 minute. That means you can notice things that happen over and over again, and those are things that you should point out with as much emphasis as possible. Those are things you should really try and pay attention to. Finally, not just, and I didn't fully write this, but you shouldn't just be giving only bad things, right? Only the things they did badly. You should also try and reflect to them what are the things they did that were good, right? What are the things that managed to convince you, right? This helps people understand what they should keep and what they should try and improve. Also, it doesn't necessarily have to be strictly about the arguments made in the debate. It can be more of your preparation obviously something's not working well there. If you didn't expect a certain argument to go forward, maybe you should try prepping the other side as well during preparation time for just like a minute, right? These are things you should know that are also very useful to do when you're giving feedback. Okay. Now there's another question, this time from Mila. Mila asks, any tips for panel management as chair? I personally feel that I sometimes struggle to manage wings in. For example, situation where a wing feels very strongly about a particular team they individually disagree on and keep on arguing for that team, even as you try to direct the discussion elsewhere. or in situations where you feel there's a disagreement on the way teams/debates should be judged. Say someone on the panel feels the second half saying the points better counts as an extension when you see no extension. 1 second, guys. Sorry. So I'm going to break that up into two things, okay? Firstly, it's important to be as let's call it assertive as possible in these cases. In the case where someone isn't listening to you, right? So not in all cases, but if a wing is being particularly difficult, this is a question of making it clear that, you know, you as chair are the one who's going to decide the discussion. And so pulling rank is legitimate in this case. However, and I'm going to step back. One, this isn't true in all cases, right? In all debates. Don't start off a debate by saying, "Hi, I'm your chair, and you will listen and do exactly as I say." And you know, we're all people at the end of the day, and so try not to be rude about it, which I am sometimes faulted with. But I think the first thing to the first step is to try and rein them in by pulling rank. So basically saying if someone is just I really think that we should discuss second half. Say, listen, at this point, I think it's going to be more useful if we discuss first half. And as the chair, I think it's important that we have this discussion in this manner. If we have time, and hopefully we will have time, I'd love to discuss the second half after we finish that. But it's important for me in order to manage this discussion that we discuss first half right now. Okay, so try and like, you know, give them hope that we're going to discuss what they want to later, but also make clear that right now we're discussing what you feel is right. The second answer is about the question of a disagreement on a more basic level, right? What do I mean by that? So you gave the example of someone says they said all the points better. They feel that's an extension. This is where there's a fundamental disagreement on, we'll call it, rules of debate. So there are two things that you can do in this situation. One is feel the room. If this is one wing and they're not a very let's call it not a wing who's likely to give you trouble if you kind of push them off to the side, then it's less important to rein them in. If you had an hour to talk about things, obviously it would be great to convince them, but at that point you need to be strategic with time management. Discussing the rules of BP debating right now in the 15 minutes you have for adjudication is not a very useful, not a very good use of time, right? However, if this is not a case where you can push them off, the wing is managing to convince other wings. There are more than one person, people on the panel who feel that saying things better and in those words is enough, or think that it's legitimate to just completely stab opening half because they said it nicely and so that's okay. Then what you want to do is to just give 2 or 3 lines as to why this can't possibly be the way you judge debate, and that way try and either convince the other people, right? Convince the other wings who are out there, or convince this wing, hopefully, but also scare them into thinking that this is a completely completely out there call, understanding really that this is a completely out way of doing it, and just by sheer ethos and fear of being that far off, they may change their mind. If there's something you'd like me to be more, if there's something you'd like me to answer a little more specifically, then post a question or a follow-up. Cool. So now we'll move back over to the back over here. Okay. So we discussed feedback. Now we're going to talk about technical ideas. The first thing is how we write when we're taking notes. So I tend to use the computer. Okay. Writing splits up into two schools of thought. The school of thought that says write everything verbatim. You want to write as many things as possible. You want to basically have word for word. You want to have word for word the debate, and that way you can look back at it and see exactly what people said. The second school of thought says it's a tool for you to kind of do active listening and thinking, and you want to minimize what you're writing to the way you understand things, right? So summarize what they just said in 4 sentences in the one sentence in one sentence, which sums up what you took away from it. I tend to think that this is something that is more of a personal issue, and I think that it tends to come down to how much you can separate what you're writing from what you're thinking. Okay, and I'll try and be more clear. When I take notes in debate, I don't really know what I'm writing. I'm just typing away at that point. My thinking, my stream of consciousness, what's going through my head, is not paying at all attention to the typing I'm doing, but is solely concentrated in thinking about the debate, right? Trying to do the comparisons in my head. If I were someone who thinks through writing, right? Who uses writing and concentrates on what they're writing while they're doing it, then it would probably be better for me to minimize what I'm writing and to try and think through my writing, right? By writing what we understand from certain sentences, we're able to go through that process of understanding, figuring out what we really understand from a few sentences. So that kind of depends on how you think. I suggest that you guys try and write as much as possible for a couple of times and see how that works for you. If you feel that it's not letting you think, if you feel that you're spending your time, instead of thinking about the debate, instead of actually judging the debate, you're spending your time worrying about your handwriting or about spelling mistakes or figuring out the exact words they used, or even just it's distracting you, come up with the way with the amount of writing that works for you. Now to the most technical part of it, how we organize our notes. So luckily I made this a while back to answer someone's question on communist case file, which, by the way, you guys should, if you aren't already part of communist case file, you should join and ask questions there, or even just read the answers that people give to others' questions. It's really a great resource that we in the debating community have. Okay, right. So the note-taking method, number one, as you can see, it has the page split into 4 with area for you to make comments, right? And you'll notice this as a trend throughout all the different note-taking methods. You need to be writing comments. You need to be writing to yourself certain thoughts that you have or feedback that you're going to give later. And these are the different methods that you have, and I'm gonna post this after this, by the way, and the slideshow will be, the PowerPoint will be posted on the event page after we finish here. And so what you need to figure out is where you put the comments. So you can put them in sidebars. You can put them while you're writing, just in a different color. Some people like more room to write, right? So they split pages into 2 instead of into 4. And some people like to have, and I personally very much suggest doing this, like to have a place to add the summary of a case. So the 2 or 3 things that you finish the case with, what the titles of the points are, or very good rebuttal, not very strong on second point, needs to be more comparative, right? Like, this is basically when you're running through in the 2 minutes and trying to have a rewind on the debate. This is going to help you very much. And obviously, placement of these things, can be on a four-person page or a 2-person page with comments written where they're talking or on a sidebar. Okay, so these are just like methods of writing. And if anyone's interested, I'll also post my Excel file, which is how I take my notes, where it kind of looks like notes method 6, basically, where you write what they're saying and then the comment is the tab to the right of it. Cool. So that's just the technical way of what you're writing. The second thing is, and this is the most important thing that I'm going to stress here, okay? You should not wait to have your calls until after the debate. During the debate, you should be constantly making comparisons and figuring out who's beating whom at this stage and what needs to be said in order to beat a different team, and is that rebuttal really answering the question, or is it kind of obfuscating the the attack it received. All of these things need to go on while you're debating, okay? You need to constantly be figuring out how persuasive you think a point is, and not just in a like arbitrary sense of it's very persuasive, but specifically, like, I think it's very impactful and I think it's not very likely, or I think it's very likely. Split them up into those 2 criterias, because it'll ultimately help you figure out comparing between teams afterwards, right? So it's just very important for me to stress that this can't all happen, all of these thought processes that we're talking about, only after the debate, but they should happen during the debate, or during and after speeches. Okay? Cool. So at this point, I'm going to open the floor to questions and answers. So if you guys have been paying attention to to me speaking instead of writing questions on Facebook, this would be a great time to start writing questions. There is approximately 20 minutes left here to half an hour, depending on how you guys want to manage the time. We can also do an active, a worked example where we'll take a debate and we'll watch it together, stopping, like take a speech or 2 speeches and watch it together, stopping it periodically to make a couple of notes. But I'm not 100% sure that that'll work through this like Hangouts. So let me know in the comments or Facebook group or whatever it is which you guys would prefer, and ask any questions you would like to on the Facebook group. Okay, so Ruslan asks how judges are ranked during tournaments. So judge ranking, depending on the tournament, splits up into two basic modes, avenues of getting feedback. One is from the people who judged with you, right? So be it chair on wing feedback or wing on chair feedback. And the second is if you're chairing a room, then feedback from the participants. Okay. So participants and judges after a round will usually fill out a feedback form where they give their opinion on the person who either judged them or judged with them. This is then taken by the tab team, and either, like, this depends on the size of the tournament, either electronically tabulated into a number value, right, or manually changed by the CA team into a numerical value, right? Ultimately, it ends up being, this depends on your tab program, but judges are ranked by a certain number they're given, and then the tab program will distribute them. And again, that depends on the tab program. So Tabby 2 prefers to stack middle rooms, especially nearing the break. Tournaman, I think, is more of an evenly spread throughout live rooms, and it basically is trying to get that to the best situation. Afterwards, the CA team looks over feedback or personal experience they've had with certain judges and decide who to break. And that's basically how judges are ranked during tournaments. Let's see if there are more questions. So Sarah Halonen said they'd be in Helsinki, would be interested to watch a debate and do an active program. I'm going to find the debate that I wanted to show you guys. And then if others concur, we'll do that and see if the Hangouts will allow for it. All right, so at this point, any debate will do. I'm going to look for a prime minister speech, just so we're not judging it in a vacuum where we don't know the like what they're rebutting. Okay, can you guys hear this? Mila and Angelos, I All right, so I'm being told that you guys can't hear this, which is a shame. All right, so I guess we'll do questions and answers. See if anyone else has. Oh, okay. So we have a bunch of. Okay. So Mila asks, how and what kind of notes do you take during deliberations? Notes for justification in particular. So usually what I'll have when I go up to give just a call justification, I think the first thing I want to note is, we go up to give a debate speech and don't expect to do it with 0 notes. And so it's kind of crazy that oftentimes we go up to give a call justification with 0 notes. So I do think notes are important. I am a minimalist in notes in general, both when I'm speaking and when I'm judging. So usually when I'm judging, I will have one word or a couple of words that'll remind me of the reasons each team come above another. So when I talk about the justification part and I compare every 2 teams, right? So within each comparison, I'll have a bunch of words that will remind me what to say there. So the main reasons. So if I were to compare 2 teams, if we take the example of the seatbelt debate, and I'm giving the feedback of opening opposition versus closing proposition, I would write down to myself to first, frame of delta, which to me means explain what the comparison is based off of and why you're only taking into account the second argument that says that, because of people being uncomfortable, they'll get into more accidents, and then that way I explain why I'm not considering the fact that they also, repeated first proposition by saying it's illegitimate. And then I'll have therefore the clash is about the argument between the two teams is about how many people will die, and then the key words, the key arguments that are going to go into the justification of why opening opposition is above closing proposition on that question. And I'll do this for every two teams that I'm comparing. So it ends up being something like 25 words overall that I'm writing down for myself, but this makes it so that I remember exactly what I want to say in each section, right? Then when we're talking about giving personal feedback, that's all written down in my notes to begin with. If there's something specific that I realize during adjudication that I want to add, then I'll write it down in that person's notes at the end, and that way I'll remember to read it to them during the feedback process, right? So yes, notes are something that you should have. I suggest having notes for justification with the logical structure that leads you to think that one team is above another. So how you compare the two teams, why that's the metric you use to compare those two teams, given that that's a metric you used, why one team is above another. And again, all of these with specific examples. By that I mean calling out the exact arguments that you're talking about, and not just saying your utilitarian case as opposed to the case where you show why more people will be harmed, right? Will be harmed by wearing seatbelts. That way they know that you know what you're talking about. And I think just in general, being able to cite specific arguments makes people more trustworthy of your call. So it's not that it makes it seem less like you're just based off of a random feeling, and more that you were listening and paying attention to what happened in the debate. Hope that answers your question. Okay, question from Jenny on YouTube. I evaluate points, comments, etc. by drawing small, quick marks at the end or at the beginning of summary of point. So I'm kind of split on that question. Just so we're clear, this is and just so we're clear that I understand what you're talking about. This is something to the extent of like a check mark, or a check mark with a cross in it, or a cross that says you don't accept an argument, or you do accept, or you somewhat accept, and kind of gives you a feeling for how much you accepted an argument when you look back at your pages. So on the one hand, I think this is a good method to be able to quickly scan your papers and figure out, did I find an argument persuasive? But on the other hand, I think it does two things. One, it sometimes makes us lazy in our categorization of how persuasive an argument was made, because it kind of dilutes an argument to a simple number as opposed to like remembering it for all its nuances and where specifically it was weak and where it was strong, and all of those things that I think are important for you to note. And I'm gonna be clear. If you note these, even though you're just making those small check marks, then that's not problematic. But I tend to see that judges who make those small check marks are more based on a general feeling of whether or not they accepted an argument. The second thing that I think may be problematic with it, and again, if this is not something that this causes, that these check marks causes, then it's fine. I tend to think that it causes people to find arguments to be judged on a binary scale, or at least to an extent, right? So an X would mean I don't accept an argument, and I'll throw back to earlier in the workshop. I don't think you can not accept an argument. I think you can think an argument is very unpersuasive and unlikely to have impact on the debate, but it's a semantic difference that does have actual impact when I see people discussing certain ideas as no, I'm not even going to weigh that up because it doesn't meet a certain burden, a certain level that I think is necessary to meet. Same thing with check marks. There's no such thing as a like factual case that is like perfectly a truism. If there is, then that's not so much an argument, right? And so so long as it's not making you think in a very binary check mark versus check mark, I don't know how to weigh those two things because they're both 100, then I think it's fine and a good way to be able to scan your notes quickly. If it does cause those things, I would be wary of it. Okay. Let's see. So Julia asks if do you / should we make such impact / likelihood graphs during judging? So I don't, and I think that's kind of a question of how much that'll help you. So to me, it's difficult for me to break it down to a scale that I feel comfortable with. I use it more as an ability to visually explain to people the thought process that goes through my head on impact and likelihood and how those two interplay. If it helps you, then that's great. I would have too much trouble doing it as like a science / engineering graduate because I don't have units, and so it would just drive me crazy not knowing how to place things on the graph. But if try it out and see if it helps you with your thought process. I tend to do it in my head, and it's just kind of the thing that drives the way I think, as opposed to something that I'm actively writing out as I go along in the debate. Olga, YouTube. Regarding local-based motions, such like Finland joining NATO or Israel-Palestine conflict, are judges supposed to know the background in depth, like local people, or general knowledge of a non-local person is enough? General knowledge of a non-local person. However, I will say that if you're debating in a local league, so if I'm debating in the Israel debating league in a Hebrew tournament that is obviously a tournament for Israelis, then the level of background information that I would expect, like the ordinary intelligent voter, is based off of the people who are at the tournament. So it's based off of an assumption of what it's likely that people there are supposed to know. And so in an Israeli tournament, for example, I think it's perfectly fine to talk about the recent like Bibi Netanyahu scandal about money laundering. That's been in the headlines. If we're in an international tournament, I doubt that made headlines there. Same thing with Finnish examples. So if you're in an international tournament, I would explain an example that you would use in Finland so that an ordinary intelligent voter who only reads headlines would understand it, even if your judge happens to be Finnish and you know they know that example. It's still, they should discount that information. Just as when I'm judging like an Israeli team on a motion in Euros or Worlds, and they use an Israeli specific example, I discount that example and pretend I don't know it. Okay, so that's basically the distinction that I would make. If you're in a local league, in a local tournament, then the local knowledge, the headlines there are something you should know. If you're in an international tournament, then only specifically, to answer your question, background knowledge that affect what happened before, historical knowledge, only to a general level and not in depth. So Mila asks, how much do you reflect on calls / justifications you've made as a judge? Have you ever practiced or helped others learn judging through means other than judging debates, tournaments / tournaments? All right, so 2 questions and 2 answers. One, reflecting on calls and justification, a scary amount. I have friends with whom I relive debates and discuss specific questions that arose and what it means for meta debate philosophy and whether or not specific rules should be changed because it doesn't allow for, like, for example, there are some gray areas in debate adjudication. For example, a clarification from second opposition to first proposition, which challenges a squirrel, is something that could happen, and it's not clear what the right thing to do is in that case, since technically, according to the rules, only leader of opposition can challenge a motion, but leader of opposition challenging a motion, the reason only they can is so that it's done at the beginning of the debate and deputy prime minister has a chance to respond, which is also the case with a clarification from opposition. So basically, I go through things a lot, and there have been cases where I come up to a friend of mine and say, listen, I went over the debate again, and I thought about a couple of things, and either I should have given you more speaks, or I'm not completely happy with the call I made on like the diagonal, and I think it may have had it should have been switched. And so those things happen, right? And you learn from them, and I think it's a healthy and important part of judging. Just by the way, to the same extent that I do with debates, I go over a debate that I did in my head afterwards and try and think, how could I have made that argument better? What could I have done to try and like realize that the clash was moved at a certain point? How could I make the comparisons I'm doing more clear to adjudicators? Most things that you try and improve in involve a certain amount of self-reflection. Then with regarding the second question, so there's the one thing that I would suggest doing to try and strengthen judging ability is to, and I think this is also the case as a rebuttal workshop, is to take a bunch of syllogisms. So, for example, all men are mortal. All people are mortal. Socrates is a person, and so Socrates is mortal is a syllogism, right? A and B, therefore C. and then hide one of them and try and figure out what the hidden assumption is. I think that helps us like understand logic and figure out logical leaps a lot better. So in the example I just gave, if I were to read out the sentence, listen, all people are mortal, and therefore Socrates is mortal, or Aristotle, or whichever I gave as the example, right? That sounds normal to us, right? That sounds like, yeah, that is a legitimate logical step, but it isn't. It's missing a step. It's missing the step in which I say, in which I say that Aristotle is a person, right? And so being able to recognize that helps you a lot with understanding where other teams are making those logical leaps. So this is true both for adjudication, to try and like understand and make sure that the way you're looking at an argument is not, that's not true because I know a different fact, but you manage to pinpoint the logical step that's missing, and that helps you figure out both how to help that team afterwards and the strength of an argument, but also as a way to work on rebuttal, just being able to notice when other teams are doing that. Just as a judge, it helps you. As a team who wants to rebut another team, it'll help you to point that out. But other than that, most workshops just involve judging. Cool. So it seems questions are basically over, and we're just about at 2 hours. So thank you very much for having me, and I very much enjoyed both giving you the workshop and your questions. You're all welcome to contact me if you ever have a question on adjudication or anything else, and I'll repeat this again, plug Communist Case File again, just because it's just like a really great resource. Good luck to you guys, and have fun.